Okay, guys. So the next method of solving quadratic equation, like I mentioned, we have done some work on factorization method. So the next method of solving quadratic equation that I mentioned before is completing the square. Completing the square. Yes, I mentioned this. Now, for us to use this method to solve quadratic equation, we have to understand what it means to make a quadratic equation a perfect square, because that's where completing the square method revolves around this. Okay, so this is the major thing that makes completing the square. So now, in mathematics, when we say something is a perfect square, it means that its square root is a whole number, right? For instance, 4 is a perfect square because why? 2 times 2 gives you what? 4. That's like the square root of 4 is what? 2. You get that, right? Good. And again, if we also say yes, so if let's also look at another number, 81. 81 is a perfect square because 9 times 9 gives us what? 81. So therefore, square root of what? 81 is going to be what? 9. All right. Plus minus 9, but we are not looking at these signs for now. So that's what we want to do. There are some quadratic equations that are there's some quadratic equations that are a perfect square. Why do we say perfect square? Because they have identical roots. Okay, let me show you one. So let's say you have x squared plus 4x plus 4. Now, if you factorize this quadratic, let me call it an expression now, because we are not equating it to 0. If you factorize this, let me change this to expression. Let me change this to expression. So if you factorize this quadratic expression, you're going to have, just following our normal method of factorizing. Okay, let me show you x and x here. What are the two things that if I multiply, I'll get 4? When I add, I get 4 is 2. So I have plus 2 plus 2. So you can see now I have x squared plus 4x plus 4, and that is equal to x plus 2. So that means x plus 2 squared is the same thing as x squared plus 4x plus 4, right? So if I'm taking the square root of this guy, square root of x squared plus 4x plus 4 is going to be the same thing as what? X plus 2. So the square root of this is this. You get it, right? Yeah. So when we make some quadratic equations are not perfect square. I mean, let me put it this way. Some quadratic expressions are not perfect squares, but we can actually make those quadratic expressions to become what? A perfect square. All right? Let me show you how. Let's say that you have um, x squared plus 2x, right? This is a quadratic expression. Remember, I mentioned the difference between a quadratic equation and a quadratic expression. If this were to be an equation, then it has to be equal to something. But this is not equal to anything, so it's a quadratic expression. Good. So if I have x squared plus 2x, a quadratic expression, and I want to make this quadratic expression as it is not a perfect square, because if I factorize it, I'm going to have x into x plus 2. So the factors are not the same. One factor is x and the other factor is x plus 2. Unlike in the previous examples where the two factors were x plus 2 and x plus 2. Oh, good. So if that's the case now, we cannot call this a perfect square, but can we make this quadratic equation a perfect square? Yes, that's this quadratic expression. I keep saying equation. Can we make this quadratic expression a perfect square? The answer is what? Yes. So how do we make it a perfect square? Now, in making this this expression a perfect square, don't worry, I'll keep making that mistake. In making this expression a perfect square, what we are going to do is to take the coefficient of x. These are the steps. Take the coefficient of x Now, what's the coefficient of x here? What's the coefficient of x here? The coefficient of x is what? 2. I used to have this problem with some people. When I ask them the coefficient of x, they think about the coefficient of x squared, not x squared. Coefficient of x. Coefficient of x here is what? 2. And we are not saying 2 because of this 2 that is here. It is 2 multiplying x. That's what we call the coefficient of x. I mentioned this earlier too. So when we take the coefficient of x, which is 2, we um, divide it by 2. I don't want to say divide it by half. If you divide it by half, it will become 4. So you divide it by 2. Okay, when you divide it by 2, so you have 2 divided by 2, that will give us what? 1, right? So 2 divided by 2 will give us what? 1. Good. After you have taken this, the next thing is to square the result. Square the result. What's the result? The result is 1. So when we square it, we still have what? 1. Then add it to the expression. Add to the expression. So in adding to the expression, this will become x squared plus 2x plus 1. Okay, if I'm to factorize this now, following the method of factorization that I have taught, if I'm to factorize this, I'm going to, okay, let me just show you at this point. I'll use x squared and multiply 1, right? So that I'll have what? 1x squared. Okay, 1x squared is the same thing as saying x squared, because how many x squared is here? Just 1. Good. So x squared, then we look for two numbers that when we multiply, we'll get x squared, and when we add, we get 2x, and that's simply x times x. X times x gives us x squared. X plus x gives us 2x. So if that's the case, we now I have to take this over to another part of the board. So I'll take this up here. I believe you still see. So we have x squared. I have to check my marker. It's running out. I have x squared plus x plus 1. Right? This is not equal to anything. It's an expression. Right? So in that case, so I now have, let's group this. So if I factorize this, x will go into x plus 1. You get this? X squared divided by x is x. X divided by x is 1. Okay? Then here what we have is what? Plus 1 into what? X plus 1. Okay? So with this, we now have x plus 1 and what? X plus 1. So you can see now that this expression is now a perfect square, because the square root of this will be what? X plus 1. Alright, so that's like saying x squared plus 2x plus 1 is equal to x plus 1 and x plus 1, or we say x plus 1 squared, squared. And if we say x plus 1 squared, this can mean that the square root of x squared plus 2x plus 1 is simply x plus 1. Alright, so this is just how this goes. So this is what we mean by making a quadratic expression a perfect square. Alright, so we can make a quadratic expression a perfect square. Alright, so we'll do another example. Thank you.